Sarah Martinez had flown this route 17 times in the past 6 months. Denver to Miami, then Miami to San Juan. The familiar weight of exhaustion settled into her bones as she buckled herself into seat 8A, the window seat she always requested when possible. After 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, flying commercial felt almost surreal in its ordinariness. The other passengers filed past her in the typical pre-flight shuffle. Business travelers checking phones, families corralling children, elderly couples moving slowly down the narrow aisle. Sarah pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes and settled back against the headrest. She had learned to sleep anywhere during her 12 years as an Air Force pilot, and civilian flights were no exception. The woman in the middle seat, 8B, was probably in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. She smiled at Sarah as she settled in with a thick paperback novel. The aisle seat remained empty as the boarding process continued around them. "Flying home or going on vacation?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. Sarah managed a polite smile. "Going home to see family in Puerto Rico." "You?" "My daughter lives in San Juan. First grandchild on the way." The woman's face lit up with joy. "I'm Margaret, by the way." "Sarah. Congratulations on becoming a grandmother." Margaret beamed and pulled out her phone to show pictures of her daughter. Sarah listened politely, offering appropriate responses while her mind drifted to her own family. Her brother Carlos would be waiting at the airport with his usual complaints about her never visiting often enough. Her mother would have enough food prepared to feed half the neighborhood, as always. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as the plane filled to capacity. Sarah noticed the crew seemed experienced and professional. The head flight attendant, a tall woman with auburn hair, moved through the cabin with confident efficiency. The 2 male attendants worked in perfect coordination, checking overhead bins and ensuring passengers were properly seated. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Sarah felt the familiar vibration of engines spooling up. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Commercial aircraft engines had a different timbre than the military jets she had flown, but the basic physics remained the same. Thrust, lift, drag, weight. The fundamental forces that made flight possible. The takeoff was smooth and routine. Sarah dozed as the aircraft climbed through the scattered clouds over Denver, heading southeast toward Florida. She had perfected the art of sleeping on planes during countless military transports, often grabbing rest between missions in conditions far worse than this comfortable commercial cabin. 2 hours into the flight, Margaret nudged her gently. "Excuse me, dear. I need to use the restroom." Sarah unbuckled and stepped into the aisle to let Margaret pass. As she stood there stretching her legs, she noticed some commotion near the front of the cabin. One of the male flight attendants was speaking quietly but urgently into the interphone. His expression was tense, and he kept glancing toward the cockpit door. A knot of unease formed in Sarah's stomach. Years of military training had honed her ability to read situations quickly, and something was definitely wrong. She remained standing in the aisle, pretending to stretch while observing the crew's behavior. The head flight attendant emerged from the forward galley and began walking toward the back of the plane. Her professional smile remained in place, but Sarah could see the stress in her eyes. The attendant stopped at several rows, speaking quietly with passengers. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but the conversation seemed serious. Margaret returned from the restroom, and Sarah sat back down. "Everything okay up there?" Margaret asked, having noticed the same activity. "Probably just routine," Sarah replied, though she didn't believe it herself. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and the entire cabin fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue that requires our attention. We may need to divert to an alternate airport as a precaution. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." Sarah's military instincts kicked into high gear. The captain's tone was calm and professional, but she recognized the underlying tension. This wasn't a minor technical issue. Something serious was happening in the cockpit. The head flight attendant continued moving through the cabin, stopping to speak with individual passengers. She was getting closer to Sarah's row, and now Sarah could see what was happening. The attendant was asking questions, looking for someone with specific qualifications. When the flight attendant reached row 8, she leaned down toward Sarah. "Excuse me, miss. I'm Linda, the head flight attendant. We're looking for anyone on board who might have aviation experience. Are you by any chance a pilot? Sarah's heart rate increased, but her expression remained calm. I have some flying experience. What kind of situation are we dealing with? Linda's relief was visible. Both pilots have become incapacitated. Food poisoning, we think. They ate the same meal at the Denver airport this morning. We need someone who can help us get this aircraft on the ground safely. The world seemed to slow around Sarah. She had trained for emergency scenarios throughout her military career, but nothing quite like this. Still, her training took over immediately. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Air Force. Retired. I have over 3,000 hours of flight time in various aircraft. She kept her voice low to avoid alarming nearby passengers. What's the current status of the pilots? Both are conscious but severely ill. Captain Williams is trying to stay functional, but he's getting worse by the minute. The first officer is in even worse shape. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. I need to get to the cockpit immediately. What type of aircraft is this? Boeing 737-800. Sarah had never flown a 737, but she knew the basic principles would be similar to other aircraft she had piloted. More importantly, she understood aviation systems, navigation, and emergency procedures. It would have to be enough. Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm gently. Are you really a pilot? I am, Sarah said softly. Don't worry. We're going to be fine. As Sarah followed Linda toward the front of the plane, she mentally cataloged everything she knew about commercial aviation. She had ridden in 737s many times as a passenger and had studied their systems out of professional curiosity. The aircraft was known for being stable and relatively straightforward to fly. The cockpit door opened as they approached, and Sarah got her first look at the crisis. Captain Williams was slumped in the left seat, his face pale and sweating. He looked up as she entered, his eyes struggling to focus. You're a pilot, he asked weakly. Air Force. 12 years. Multiple aircraft types. Sarah moved to stand behind the center console, quickly scanning the instrument panel. The autopilot was engaged, and the aircraft was maintaining level flight at 37,000 feet. Thank God, Williams whispered. I don't think I can't stay conscious much longer. The first officer was worse off, barely responsive in the right seat. Sarah could see that both men were fighting to stay functional, but they were losing the battle rapidly. What's our current position and destination? Sarah asked, slipping into command mode. Williams struggled to point at the navigation display. En route to Miami. About 90 minutes out. But we need to divert. Can't make it that long. Sarah studied the displays, her military training helping her interpret the information quickly. The aircraft was flying smoothly on autopilot, but that wouldn't last forever. Eventually, they would need to descend, navigate to an airport, and land. That meant she would need to take control. Nearest suitable airport? Tampa, Williams managed. About 60 miles ahead. Long runway, good approaches. Sarah nodded and keyed the radio mic. Tampa approach, this is United 447. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit and need to declare an emergency. Requesting vectors to Tampa International. The response was immediate. United 447, Tampa approach. Understand you're declaring an emergency. Say nature of emergency and souls on board. Tampa approach, both pilots are incapacitated due to food poisoning. We have 147 souls on board. I'm a qualified military pilot attempting to assist with the emergency. There was a brief pause before the controller responded. United 447, Roger. We're clearing all traffic from your area. Turn right heading 180, descend to flight level 300. We're vectoring you direct to Tampa. Sarah reached for the autopilot controls, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. She had been in combat situations where lives hung in the balance, but this felt different. These weren't soldiers who had signed up for danger, they were civilians who trusted that their routine flight would end safely. Captain Williams was fading fast. The approach charts are in the side pocket there, he whispered, pointing weakly. Sarah found the charts and began studying the approaches to Tampa International. The aircraft would need to descend from 37,000 feet, navigate to the airport, and execute a precision approach to land safely. With passengers and crew counting on her, failure wasn't an option. Linda, Sarah called to the flight attendant who had remained in the cockpit. "I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them we're diverting to Tampa due to the pilots becoming ill, and that a qualified pilot is now assisting. Keep it calm and reassuring." As Linda left to address the passengers, Sarah continued studying the approach charts and aircraft systems. The 737 was more complex than some of the aircraft she had flown, but the basic principles remained the same. She would need to hand-fly the approach, as she wasn't familiar enough with the aircraft's automated systems to trust them in this situation. Captain Williams had lost consciousness entirely now. The first officer was still marginally aware but couldn't provide any meaningful assistance. Sarah was effectively alone in controlling an aircraft carrying 147 people, flying a type she had never piloted before. She keyed the mic again. "Tampa approach, United 447. Both pilots are now unconscious. I'll be conducting the approach with minimal assistance. Request vectors for the longest available runway and emergency equipment standing by. United 447, understood. We're giving you runway 10 right, 11,002 feet. All emergency equipment is being positioned. You're cleared to descend to 15,000 feet, maintain heading 180. Sarah reached for the autopilot controls and began the descent. The aircraft responded smoothly to her inputs, maintaining stable flight as it came down from altitude. Outside the windows, she could see the Florida coastline approaching. This was just the beginning. The real challenge would come during the approach and landing phase, when she would need to hand-fly the aircraft through a precise sequence of maneuvers to bring it safely to the ground. Every passenger's life depended on her ability to adapt 12 years of military flight experience to this unfamiliar aircraft. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, but Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her well in combat. She had a job to do, and she would do it. There was no other option. The hotel room overlooked Tampa Bay, its windows reflecting the orange glow of sunset. Sarah stood at the glass, still wearing the same clothes she had worn on Flight 447 that morning. The events of the day felt like something from a movie rather than her own experience. Her phone had been ringing almost non-stop since word of the emergency landing spread to the media. She had turned it to silent mode after the 15th call from reporters wanting interviews. United Airlines had arranged for all passengers to stay overnight in Tampa while they sorted out alternative flights to their destinations. Most passengers had been eager to get rooms and decompress from the day's events, but several had lingered in the hotel lobby hoping to speak with Sarah again. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she could see Margaret holding a bottle of wine and wearing a grateful smile. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Margaret said when Sarah opened the door. "I thought you might need some company tonight. This has to have been overwhelming for you too." Sarah stepped aside to let her in. "Actually, I could use the company. Today has been intense." Margaret settled into one of the room's chairs while Sarah grabbed 2 glasses from the bathroom. "In all my years of flying, I never imagined something like this could happen," Margaret said. "When that flight attendant started asking about pilots, I thought it was some kind of joke. I've been in plenty of emergency situations during my military career, but this was different," Sarah admitted as she poured the wine. "In combat, you're prepared for things to go wrong. This morning, I was just trying to get home to see family." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching boats move across the bay in the distance. Sarah found herself thinking about the phone calls she had received that afternoon. Her brother Carlos had been worried sick when he heard about the flight diversion on the news. Her mother had cried when Sarah called to explain what had happened. "Tell me about your military service," Margaret said gently. "What made you become a pilot?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "I grew up watching planes at the airport in San Juan. My father worked maintenance there, and sometimes he would take me to work with him on weekends. I was fascinated by how these massive machines could lift off the ground and fly." She took a sip of wine before continuing. "When I got to college, I joined ROTC and discovered I had natural aptitude for flying. The Air Force gave me opportunities one never could have imagined as a kid watching planes from the fence line. 12 years is a long career." "What made you decide to leave?" "Honestly? I was getting tired of being away from family so much. Multiple deployments, constant training exercises, always being ready to go somewhere at a moment's notice. I wanted to come back to Puerto Rico and be closer to home. Margaret nodded understandingly. And now you've used all that training to save a plane full of strangers. There's something poetic about that. Sarah's phone buzzed with another call, this one from a number she recognized. Major General Patricia Hayes, her former wing commander, was someone she couldn't ignore. I need to take this, Sarah apologized. Martinez, I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. General Hayes's voice was warm with pride. The whole Pentagon is talking about what you did today. You've made the entire Air Force look good. Thank you, ma'am. I just did what I was trained to do. That training saved 147 lives today. We're all incredibly proud of you. The general paused before continuing. I'm calling because I want to offer you something. How would you feel about coming back to active duty as an instructor pilot? We need someone with your experience and judgment teaching the next generation. Sarah felt a surge of unexpected emotion. 6 months ago, she had been eager to leave military life behind. Now, after proving to herself that her skills could make a real difference in civilian situations, the idea of returning to teach others was appealing. Can I have some time to think about it, General? Of course. Take all the time you need. But, Sarah, what you did today reminded everyone why we train the way we do. Your ability to stay calm under pressure and execute a perfect emergency landing, that's what military aviation is all about. After hanging up, Sarah found Margaret watching her with interest. Good news? My old commander offered me a chance to come back as an instructor pilot. Sarah sat back down, her mind racing with possibilities. 6 months ago, I would have said no immediately. Now, I'm not sure. What changed? Sarah considered the question carefully. Today made me realize that all those years of training weren't just about being ready for combat. They were about being ready to step up when people need help, regardless of the situation. Margaret smiled. Sounds like you're leaning toward saying yes. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang again. This time it was Carlos, finally, returning her earlier call. Sarah. I've been in meetings all afternoon and just saw the news. Are you okay? What happened up there? Sarah spent the next 20 minutes explaining the day's events to her brother. His concern gradually shifted to amazement as she described taking control of the aircraft and executing the emergency landing. I can't believe my sister is a hero, Carlos said with obvious pride. Mom has been showing the news coverage to everyone in the neighborhood. She's telling people she always knew you would do something special with your life. I'm not a hero, Carlos. I'm just a pilot who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Don't be so modest. You saved 147 people today. That makes you a hero in my book. After ending the call with her brother, Sarah realized that Margaret had quietly left during the conversation, leaving behind a note thanking her again and wishing her well with whatever decision she made about her future. Sarah walked back to the window, looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle across Tampa. The emergency landing felt like it had happened days ago rather than hours. She thought about the passengers who were now safely in their hotel rooms, probably calling their own families to describe their harrowing day. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The message was from Linda, the head flight attendant from Flight 447. Colonel Martinez, I wanted to thank you again for what you did today. In 22 years of flying, I've never experienced anything like this. Your professionalism and skill gave all of us confidence that we were going to be okay. Several passengers have asked me to share their contact information with you. They want to stay in touch and thank you properly when they've had time to process everything. The email included a list of passenger names and contact information, along with brief messages from each person. Sarah found herself tearing up as she read through them. From a businessman in seat 12A, you gave me the chance to see my daughter graduate from college next month. From a young mother traveling with 2 small children, my kids will grow up knowing that heroes are real because of what you did today. From Margaret, you reminded an old woman that there are still people willing to risk everything for strangers. Sarah closed the laptop and walked to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. The woman looking back at her from the mirror seemed different somehow. The events of Flight 447 had changed something fundamental about how she saw herself and her place in the world. Her military training had always been about being ready to serve and protect, but she had thought that chapter of her life was over. Today had shown her that service came in many forms, and her skills could make a difference in ways she had never anticipated. The phone rang one more time, and Sarah was surprised to see her mother's number. "Mija, I've been watching the news all day. Are you really okay?" "I'm fine, Mama. Just tired. The reporters are saying you're a hero. They're calling you the pilot who saved Flight 447. Sarah sat down on the bed, suddenly, feeling the full weight of exhaustion. "I just did my job, Mama." "Your job was to be a passenger on that plane. What you did was much more than a job." Her mother's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. Your father would have been proud too." The mention of her father, who had died 3 years earlier, brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. He had been the one who first encouraged her love of flying, taking her to work at the airport and explaining how planes worked. "I keep thinking about what he would say about today," Sarah whispered. "He would say that all those hours he spent teaching you about airplanes finally paid off in the most important way possible." After talking with her mother for another half hour, Sarah finally felt ready to try to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more questions, and eventually the flight to Puerto Rico that had been interrupted by the day's events. But tonight, she had decisions to make about her future. The offer to return to active duty as an instructor pilot was tempting, especially after today's reminder of how valuable her skills could be. At the same time, she had originally left the military to be closer to family, and that desire hadn't changed. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that Flight 447 had given her something unexpected, a clear sense of purpose that had been missing since her retirement. Whether she returned to the Air Force or found another way to use her skills, she now knew that her story as a pilot was far from over. The lights of Tampa continued to sparkle outside her window as Sarah finally fell asleep, still processing the day that had transformed her from a passenger into a hero, and reminded her that sometimes the most important flights are the ones you never planned to take. In the morning, she would face a media frenzy and difficult decisions about her future. But tonight, she rested with the satisfaction of knowing that 147 people were safe in their beds because of her training, skill, and willingness to step up when duty called, even on what was supposed to be a routine flight home to see family. 3 months had passed since Flight 447, and Sarah found herself standing in front of the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, wearing her dress uniform for the first time in almost a year. The morning air was crisp and thin at altitude, reminding her of countless early mornings during her active duty years. Today marked her first day as Chief Instructor Pilot for Emergency Procedures Training, a newly created position that General Hayes had designed specifically for her. The events over Tampa had convinced the Air Force leadership that they needed someone with real-world emergency experience to enhance their training programs. "Colonel Martinez?" A young second lieutenant approached with obvious nervousness. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim. I'll be your aide for the transition period." Sarah smiled, remembering her own nervousness as a new officer. "Good to meet you, Lieutenant. Ready to revolutionize how we teach emergency procedures?" The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of media attention, speaking engagements, and, ultimately, the decision to return to active duty. The turning point had come during a ceremony at the White House, where she received the Presidential Citizens Medal for her actions on Flight 447. Standing in the Rose Garden, shaking hands with the president, Sarah had realized that her experience could benefit more than just the 147 passengers who had been on that plane. Her emergency landing had exposed gaps in commercial aviation emergency procedures, and her unique perspective could help bridge military and civilian aviation training. The first group of students is waiting in Classroom Alpha, Lieutenant Kim informed her as they walked through the academy grounds. 20 pilot trainees, all within 6 months of graduation. They've been specially selected for this program. Sarah nodded, reviewing her lesson plan one final time. She had spent weeks developing a curriculum that combined traditional emergency procedures training with real-world scenarios based on actual incidents. Flight 447 would be the cornerstone case study, but she had researched dozens of other emergencies to create comprehensive training scenarios. The classroom was filled with eager young faces, all future Air Force pilots who would soon be responsible for million-dollar aircraft and precious cargo. Sarah remembered the mixture of excitement and apprehension she had felt at their age, ready to take on the world but still learning what it meant to be responsible for other people's lives. "Good morning, future aviators," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that 12 years of military service had given her. I'm Colonel Martinez, and I'm here because 3 months ago, I found myself in a situation that no amount of traditional training had prepared me for. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing a photo of United Flight 447 on the tarmac in Tampa, surrounded by emergency vehicles. How many of you have heard about this incident? Every hand in the room went up, along with several excited murmurs. The story of Flight 447 had become legendary in aviation circles, studied at flight schools and discussed in pilot forums around the world. I was passenger 8A on this flight when both pilots became incapacitated due to food poisoning. I had to take control of a Boeing 737, an aircraft I had never flown before, and execute an emergency landing with 147 lives depending on my decisions. Sarah paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The reason I'm here today isn't to tell you hero stories. It's to teach you that emergency situations don't follow the textbook, and your ability to adapt and think critically under pressure will determine whether people live or die. For the next 2 hours, Sarah walked the students through every detail of Flight 447, from the moment she realized something was wrong to the final touchdown in Tampa. She emphasized the decision-making process, the importance of clear communication with air traffic control, and how military training principles apply to civilian emergency situations. The key lesson from Flight 447, Sarah concluded, is that your training doesn't end when you memorize procedures. Real emergencies require you to think, adapt, and apply your knowledge to situations you've never encountered before. One student raised her hand. Colonel, how did you stay calm when you realized you were responsible for all those passengers? Sarah smiled, remembering the same question from countless interviews over the past 3 months. The calm came from confidence in my training and acceptance of responsibility. When people's lives are in your hands, you don't have the luxury of panic. You fall back on your training and do the job. After class, Sarah walked to her new office in the flight training building. The walls were bare except for a single-frame photograph, the crew and passengers of Flight 447 at a reunion dinner held in Tampa the previous month. United Airlines had arranged the event, and seeing everyone together again had been deeply emotional for Sarah. Margaret had been there, proudly showing off pictures of her new grandson. Several passengers had become personal friends, staying in touch through social media and occasional visits. The businessman from C-12A had indeed watched his daughter graduate from college, and the young mother's children had drawn pictures of airplanes to give to Sarah. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Lieutenant Kim entered with a stack of files. Colonel, these are the applications for next month's emergency procedures course. We've received requests from civilian pilots, airline training programs, and even international air forces who want to send their pilots through your program. Sarah flipped through the applications, amazed at the response. Word of her innovative training program had spread throughout the aviation community, and everyone wanted their pilots to benefit from lessons learned from Flight 447. Schedule them all, Sarah decided. If we're going to prevent future emergencies, we need to reach as many pilots as possible. Her computer chimed with an email from Captain Williams, the pilot from Flight 447 who had recovered fully from the food poisoning incident. He had returned to flying and had become an advocate for enhanced emergency training programs. Sarah, just wanted you to know that United is implementing your recommended changes to their emergency procedures manual. The lesson you taught about adapting military decision-making principles to civilian aviation is now part of their required training for all pilots. Thank you for turning our worst day into something that will help countless future flights. Sarah smiled and began typing her response. Captain Williams had become more than a colleague, he was a friend who understood the unique bond shared by people who had faced life-or-death situations together. The afternoon was spent reviewing training curricula and meeting with other instructors who would be teaching alongside her. The program was ambitious, combining classroom instruction, flight simulator training, and real-world scenario exercises designed to prepare pilots for the unexpected. At 5 p.m., Sarah's phone rang with a call she had been expecting. Carlos was calling from Puerto Rico with updates on their mother's health. The cancer diagnosis had come 2 weeks after Flight 447, adding another layer of complexity to Sarah's decision about returning to active duty. The treatments are going well, Carlos reported. Dr. Rodriguez says she's responding better than expected. She keeps telling everyone that her daughter's heroism gave her the strength to fight. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt. Her mother had been incredibly supportive of the decision to return to the Air Force, but Sarah knew the separation was difficult for both of them. I can get leave to come home whenever you need me, Sarah offered. I know you can, and that's enough. Mom is so proud of what you're doing with the training program. She says you're using what happened on Flight 447 to save future lives, and that's exactly what she would expect from her daughter. After the call with Carlos, Sarah walked to the Academy's observation deck, which offered a panoramic view of the Colorado Springs area. Cadets were conducting evening formation runs on the grounds below, their synchronized movements reminding her of her own time as a student many years ago. Her reflection was interrupted by the approach of Colonel James Thompson, her immediate supervisor and an old friend from her active duty days. "How was your first day as our star instructor?" he asked with a grin. "Challenging and rewarding," Sarah replied honestly. "These students are sharp. They're asking questions I never thought of when I was their age." That's because they have an instructor who's actually lived through the situations she's teaching about. Most of us can only speculate about what we would do in a real emergency. You've proven what works. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains. Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning in Seat 8A. The retired pilot who just wanted to visit family had become a national figure and a key voice in aviation safety reform. "Any regrets about coming back?" Thompson asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "None. Flight 447 reminded me that service takes many forms. Teaching these future pilots how to handle emergencies feels like the most important mission I've ever had." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Saw your interview on the aviation channel tonight. You're inspiring a whole new generation of pilots. My grandson will grow up in a safer flying world because of what you're doing." As darkness fell over the academy, Sarah made her way back to her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to share the lessons learned from Flight 447. The emergency landing that had started as a passenger's nightmare had become the foundation for her most meaningful contribution to aviation safety. In her apartment, Sarah opened her laptop to review lesson plans for the next day's classes. An email notification caught her attention, a message from a young airline pilot who had completed her emergency procedures course the previous month. "Colonel Martinez, I wanted to thank you for the training. Yesterday, I experienced an engine failure on approach to Denver. Thanks to your course, I remained calm, followed proper procedures, and landed safely with all passengers unharmed. The techniques you taught about decision-making under pressure made all the difference. You didn't just save the people on Flight 447, you're saving people every day through the pilots you train." Sarah smiled and began typing her response, but first she looked at the photo from the Flight 447 reunion on her desk. Those 147 faces reminded her every day why her work mattered. Each student she trained would go on to fly thousands of flights and carry millions of passengers. The lessons learned in Seat 8A would ripple forward through generations of aviators. As she prepared for bed, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the path her life had taken. The emergency that could have been a tragedy had instead become the beginning of a new chapter dedicated to making aviation safer for everyone. Flight 447 had ended with a safe landing in Tampa, but its real impact was just beginning. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of another classroom of eager students, sharing the story of how a sleeping passenger became a hero and how that experience could prepare them for their own moments of truth in the cockpit. The legacy of Flight 447 would live on in every emergency successfully handled by the pilots she trained, ensuring that her one extraordinary day would continue saving lives for years to come.